The following is a production of Texas Lutheran University. For more information, please visit tlu.edu.
Good evening. Welcome to tonight's lecture by Father Richard Rohr. And a special welcome to all of you who are guests on our campus tonight. I'm Greg Ronning, the campus pastor, and we're so glad to be able to host this event tonight and to share Texas Lutheran University with you all. Before we introduce our speaker, I'd like to begin with a few thank yous. Thanks to the Brandis Fund for Religious Activities for funding the TLU contribution to this event. And thanks to the staff of Jackson Auditorium and the Dramatic Media Department who has a play coming up but said we could use the space anyway. So thanks to them for making the use of the facility possible tonight. And thanks to those of you who are visiting with us tonight, especially our partners in this event, males, men as learners and elders, and the generous donations that you have made this evening to help make it all possible. I would now like to introduce Jim Taylor, who will then introduce our distinguished speaker. Jim Taylor is the pastor of Mosaic Community Church across the street and a good friend of TLU. Jim has been involved with Richard Rohr's work through males and serves on their council of elders. So, Jim Taylor.
Richard Rohr is a Franciscan priest and an internationally renowned speaker and conference leader. He is a best-selling author of many books on subjects such as community building, peace and justice, male spirituality, and the Enneagram. Father Rohr spends a great deal of time conducting lectures, seminars, and retreats around the world. Titles of some of his most popular works include Simplicity, Everything Belongs, Exploring the Gift of Contemplative Prayer, Breathing Underwater, Adam's Return, and From Wild Man to Wise Man. In fact, Richard has published more than 30 books, which all by itself is staggering. I have to say more than because Richard doesn't know the exact number of the books he's published. And what's more amazing than that is that I asked around and none of the staff knew either. I guess you just stopped counting after, 10, 12, 15? I don't know. Richard is probably best known for his pioneering work on the relationship between our inner being and the way we live and act in the world. He founded the Center for Action and Contemplation in New Mexico, which is committed to exploring ways in which living the contemplative life and undertaking the inner work of meditation can lead to more authentic action and being and bring about radical transformation in our lives, in our communities, and in our world. Richard says, quote, "I believe there is a deep dilemma and contradiction at the heart of institutional Christianity. Maybe it's even a necessary one. All I know is that it can only be resolved by authentic inner experience, prayer, mysticism." And I think that quote is pushing towards transformation. Father Rohr has been busy throughout his career, but what is most near and dear to our hearts is that he is the founder and director of the CAC, Center of Action and Contemplation, in Albuquerque. One of the several aspects of that ministry includes working with men. Not that we need it that much, but it has still been helpful. His work in masculine spirituality is, of course, what has brought many men here tonight. We like to say that we're initiated men, even though I have not been able to tell my wife exactly what we've been initiated into. But maybe Richard can help us with that. When I got back from my own men's rite of passage, my wife asked me, she said, "Well, how was it?" And I said, "Well, I really don't have the words to explain it." She said, "Well, try." After a couple of weeks of thinking on the subject, I tried, and she's pretty convinced that I belong to some desert cult, and I just won't tell her the truth. I suppose it's because we play drums and the fact that I compulsively mention Richard 3 or 4 times a day. And then there's also this: whenever she wants a direct answer to anything, and she demands it on the spot, my eyes will glaze over, and I'll say, "When I was a boy, I thought as a boy. Now that I'm a man, I think as a man." It doesn't really impress her anymore, Richard. When Pastor Greg asked me to introduce Father Richard, I thought about all the things that Richard has come to mean to me and so many others, and I really just couldn't imagine where to start. Certainly this is true. Here is a man that many people have come to love, to respect, and appreciate. Richard, may what you have stirred in us outlive all of us. Help me welcome Father Richard Rohr.
That was very kind. Thank you. Thank you, Jim. A delight to be here. Before this day, this town was just a name for me, and now it's become very real. We had so many men from this part of the country make our rites of passage, and I kept hearing about it, but now I'm finally here. So I hope the evening can be something helpful, interesting, maybe even directional, possibly. It'll be what I hope you need it to be to lead you to the next step of your journey. As I mentioned to the smaller group earlier, when I entitled the book Falling Upward, I actually thought it would not be accepted by the publisher because I presumed there'd be many other books already who would have thought of that title. And yet I think the mystery or the paradox of the wording, falling upward, is not something that's easy to talk about. And yet as a Christian, I'm absolutely convinced it's the very heart of what we call the death and resurrection mystery of Christ. But that isn't just true for Christians. Jesus was just naming the pattern of reality, how it works, how things unfold, how things move forward. And I hope in a very abbreviated way I can do that tonight, and then leave some time, if possible, for some questions and hopeful responses. I've learned not to say question and answer. I say question and response, because I don't know that there are answers to everything. In fact, that might be a good way to start this talk. In fact, it's a perfect way to start this talk. The frontispiece of the book, I quote Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist, and he says, the greatest and most important problems of life are fundamentally unsolvable. They can never be solved. They are only outgrown. I had to live to 68 to absolutely believe that that's true. That things that I fevered about as a young man, the big ones at least, really I still haven't resolved. But there's a part of me now that doesn't need to resolve them. That's what changes. And yet, if I can jump to one further level of paradox, that is a resolution. Not needing to resolve it is a kind of resolution at a deeper level. Then I also quote in the frontispiece that English mystic, probably my favorite, Julian of Norwich. And she says, first there is the fall, then there is the recovery from the fall, and both are the mercy of God. Now, probably if you were raised in religion, you would recognize the second, that the recovery from the fall is the mercy of God. But who of us would have ever believed that the falling itself is the mercy of God? So that's my book that came out just 10 days ago on the 12 steps. Because I don't believe there's any program on the scene that names that quite so honestly and so clearly and so practically by its very first step. The admission of powerlessness is saying that you start by falling. Now, brothers and sisters, that's about as counterintuitive as the ego will ever be ready for. And maybe that's why the gospel has had so little success. It's just too counterintuitive to believe that in fact you fall upward, but that you've got to fall to know what upward even is, or what the direction might be. So I'm going to try very quickly to talk about the three parts of the book and give you the skeleton story behind the book, and that should take more than enough time. The first part of the book, the first third of the chapters, are my attempt to describe what I call the first half of life. Now, that might not be a term you're familiar with. Let me say that it doesn't literally mean chronology. I remember working in the Children's Cancer Hospital in Cincinnati when I was a young priest, and meeting literally 10-year-old kids who were in the second half of life. And I'm sorry to say, I meet people my age who are still in the first half of life. So don't make it chronological. It has to do with the unfolding of the mystery and how much you resist that and how much you allow that. I describe the first half of life as the necessary task, which I might add we're not doing very well in our country, of creating your own ego identity, your own boundaries, your own sense of self. I am this, I am not that. And I'm afraid that is the way you start. I call it in my book, The Naked Now, dualistic thinking. That by and large, people form their identity in the first half of life by distinguishing themselves from other people. And you can see them, they overdo it when they're teenagers especially. I'm not this, I'm not that. And so you have to put down another race, another religion, another gender. It's largely a negative foundation for identity. It's been enough in most of history. You didn't need to know who you were. You just needed to know you weren't French or Spanish or Italian or Catholic or whatever you thought was terrible. And you can see that this doesn't get you very far. It's your attempt and your necessary attempt to build what I call in the book your container. Just a metaphor I use, maybe not necessarily the best. But you have to have a container. You have to say, I am this, even if you start by doing it negatively. And you do this by the way you dress, the people you associate with, the education you get, the ethnicity you identify with, the color of your skin, your sexual orientation. All of this says, I am this, I am this. It's okay. There's not much depth to it yet, but you got to do it. And you got to do it to get started. The trouble is, you become so identified with the container that you spend the rest of your life protecting it, promoting it, defending it, proving it's the best. I always say, I grew up in Kansas, which in some ways no way prepared me for the life that I've lived. And on another level, absolutely prepared me. Because I couldn't have grown up, probably like a lot of you, much more conservative, traditional. We just thought we were the heart of America, of course, the state right in the center. We were the home of Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz and everything good and wonderful about America. We didn't question very much, particularly in the 40s and 50s when I was growing up. We just knew that America was the best country in the world, and we were right at the heart of it. Then, no offense to any other denomination that might be here, but I was Roman Catholic, And, of course, we were the mother church. We just didn't understand why anybody else wouldn't want to be Catholic. Everybody else was heretics, barely going to heaven. It was a wonderful way to begin, In fact, we never really put down Protestants. I never heard an anti-Protestant sermon my entire life, We just felt sorry for you. Felt very sorry. Those poor things, they have such ugly churches, and they just don't know how to decorate churches the way we do. But that's all right. So I was the best on at least two counts. I was American and I was Roman Catholic, the one true Holy Catholic Apostolic Church. And then, no offense to my sisters here, but I was male. Well, in the 1940s and 1950s, and even well into the 60s and 70s, we males were given the impression that God sort of liked us a little more than women, all right? That we were the chosen. So again, this created a great container. I mean, I was just superior, and I was white-skinned. Besides, gave me a great big head start. We had all the power. We were the ones that God also loved the most. It served me well. It really did. There wasn't much truth in it at all, but it got me off to a good start. So I want you to apply that to yourself, whatever your stories were. It's the best way to start. It's the easiest way to grow up. The healthiest people I know grow up with very traditional beginnings, where you know who you are, you know who you're not, you know what's good about who you are. It's the best way to begin. It is not the best way to continue, although most people do, and it's certainly not the best place to end. As for me, the gospel makes very clear. For example, when Jesus calls the first disciples, tells them to leave their nets and their father and to come to a new place, just as God told Abraham. But we weren't trained too much in going to new places. We liked the old, because it was us, because it was our comfort zone. So the paradox is this, that if you build your container well, you know what? You don't need it. It's like if you're a good parent, I hate to tell you this, but if you're a good parent, your kids don't need you. Isn't that a paradox, huh? That you've made them so secure that they can walk out of the house, love you forever, but don't need to come back every Sunday to know who they are. That's called, as the 12 steppers rightly call it, codependency. That do you have an identity apart from your beginnings? A lot of people don't, huh? It becomes, instead of a place, a house that you leave from, it becomes a house that you're imprisoned in. So my thesis in much of the book, Falling Upward, is that a large percentage of people never get to the second half of their own life. If the first half of life is building your container, and if your temptation is to say, my container is better than your container, I've got the only one true container that God loves and prefers, you never get very far. So what Thomas Merton called your private salvation project, and we all create one, your private salvation project, that why you're the best, has to fall apart. It has to. That's predictable. It's called the cross in Christian language, Jesus' salvation project, what he assumed he was going to do, fell apart after 3 years. I mean, this is all written out for us rather clearly. But the middle chapters have some rather unfelicitous titles, like The Tragic Sense of Life, Stumbling Over the Stumbling Stone, Necessary Suffering, Home and Homesickness, Amnesia and the Big Picture. Necessary suffering is, again to quote Carl Jung, he says there's a necessary suffering to being a human being. And if you try to avoid and deny that necessary suffering, the irony is, brothers and sisters, you bring on yourself 10 times more suffering in the long run. I was a jail chaplain in Albuquerque for 14 years. And without any doubt, I can say, the jail, well, in terms of our male work, I didn't know a guy in the jail who had a good father. There was just no good fathers around. And so these boys lashed out at all authority figures. Every authority became the rejecting father that they never had or did have and didn't know how to love them. But more than that, what I saw in the jail, and maybe that's what a father partially teaches you, was the inability or unwillingness, the lack of impulse control to endure necessary suffering. And already by 17, 18, these young boys and young girls had so ruined their lives by addiction and drugs and robberies and all kinds of destructiveness toward their own body that, I just wanted to cry sometimes. This guy's going to be in jail for 30 years, and he's just a kid, and he doesn't know anything, and he's just begging for some kind of guidance, some kind of truth, some kind of father or mother that he never had. And then he comes into a negative system that doesn't even know how to give it to him. That's why I wrote the chapter on the tragic sense of life. A tragedy is an incident where everybody loses, where there's no sense to it. It's like, why do people shoot themselves in the foot? Why can human beings be so utterly self-destructive? And those are the questions that Bill Wilson, of course, asked in the 12-step program. We really are our own worst enemy. Again, because my real background is in Scripture, I couldn't help but make the connection between those somewhat embarrassing exorcism stories we Christians are subjected to, Jesus is always driving out devils. But if you read the stories, you see they're always stories of people who are operating out of self-defeating, self-destructive behavior that they cannot not do. That's our modern word for that is addiction. It's the same thing. They just called it being possessed by a demon. But the real evidence for what's happening is the same. And if you've ever lived with an addict, you know what I'm talking about. You know this person is not evil, bad, but why do they act so evil and so bad and seem to destroy themselves and everybody else around them? You can see why the Scriptures, what else could you call it but a devil? Because they knew that person wasn't bad, and so I guess the devil made them do it. Now we're learning many forms of exorcism. Maybe more positively we call it healing. Most positively we call it love and touch and caring and community. But necessary suffering is something that if you're not taught in the first half of life, and that's what a good parent does for you. They give you some necessary limits and boundaries to your natural egocentricity. And as much as we love our cute little kids, you all know, you are parents, they're totally egocentric. They really do think, why would they not? I did, that they're the center of the world. Because my mom and dad loved me so much, I could feel I was the center of the world. But then they balanced that love by telling me, Dickie, that's what they called me, you're not the center of the world. Your sisters have rights, and your brother has rights, and your mom and dad have rights, and the neighbors have rights, and that's called impulse control, right? That's already preparing you for stumbling over the stumbling stone when you find that you're not the center of the world. In fact, you're not the center of anything except the heart of God. Everything else, you're just one of the team. You're one of the group. You're one of this bit of humanity. But if you've had no training in stumbling over the stumbling stone, the necessary stumbling stone, the necessary failures in the middle of life, the necessary betrayals, rejections, loss of job, loss of money, death, it's pretty hard to do all your homework in the last minute. And so a lot of people just sort of check out. They don't know what to do. There's no training in falling. It's especially in our country where everything is about success and denying failure and even making our failures look like successes. That's, the whole world can see that's the American typology, except Americans, because we grow up that way. And we get it with our mother's milk, that to be an American is to be driven towards success and achievement and accomplishment and higher up at all costs. So even the gospel itself becomes even more impossible to believe in this kind of world. I use as the skeleton of the book, excuse me, a Greek myth. Some of you probably had to study it in college. It was called the Odyssey by Homer, written about 700 years before Christ. And, you realize the great truths, if they're really true, have always been true. The truth didn't start at some moment in history. It's been revealed in the very pattern of reality. And that's why so many of us find even the Christian gospel affirmed by non-Christian texts. Because if it's true, it's true. Or as St. Thomas Aquinas said, if it's true, you don't ask who said it, you ask, is it true? And if it's true, it's always from the Holy Spirit. If it's true, it's always from the Holy Spirit. And in Homer's Odyssey, perhaps you know, we have the 20-year journey of a man who's become a hero in the Trojan War. So he's made it to the top, what he thinks is the top, and now he's got to try to get back home to where he was king, island Ithaca. And it takes him 20 years to get back home. It's almost like the Jewish journey of 40 years in the desert, because he's going around in circles, he gets it, he loses it. Obviously, you see after a while, this is a parable of human life. And all the temptations and setbacks and cynicisms and fears are there in that 20-year journey. When he finally gets there, and you're all ready for an American happy ever after conclusion, he realizes that when he was traveling through Hades, now Hades is not the same as the Christian hell. It is pretty much when you've hit the bottom, yes. Became overlapped with the Christian notion of hell for some people. But in Hades, when Odysseus has hit the bottom, the prophet Tiresias speaks to him. And he says, which he totally forgets in his excitement and his fear, when you in fact get back to island Ithaca, you're going to have to go on a second journey. Well, he forgets that, like most of us do. Most of us don't know there's any second journey. We just get so invested in getting our education, getting our job, making our money, getting married, having our children, and waiting for the grandchildren to come home and visit us that we think that's life. That's really just the first journey. So sure enough, Odysseus gets back to Ithaca, makes love to his wife Penelope, is able to see his father Laertes before he dies. His son Telemachus comes running toward him. It's a wonderful father-son reunion of a wounded son who never knew his father. And there's even the little dog Argos wagging his tail right before he dies. It's a lovely, lovely story, huh? But after he's made love to Penelope and reunited with dad and son, and we expect, and they lived happily ever after, damn it, he remembers the prophecy. And he says, you know what, Penelope? Tiresias told me that I got to go on a second journey. 20 years it took him to get home, you know. Who wants to go? Who wants to leave his father and his father's nets like John and James and go on a second journey? Again, I have to allude to the three monotheistic religions, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, all begin with the same identical founding story of Abraham and Sarah, who are settled, have their land, their camels, their reputation. They're set, you know. They're just waiting for their retirement account to check in. And God comes and says, leave it. Wow. Talk about counterintuitive. Now you all know that if you were raised in any of the three monotheistic religions, probably Christianity. That's our founding story. Do we believe it? Barely, if at all. We're not about leaving anything. We're about protecting things, what we already have, Texas, America, the disciples of Christ, or whatever group is your home base. That's called loyalty. Well, it isn't true to the founding myth, which says you got to go beyond that. And that's what Odysseus realizes. And so he sets out again, says goodbye to Penelope and Telemachus and Laertes, and sets out. And he remembers then that the prophet said, return to the mainland and carry an oar over your shoulder. Now, the oar was the symbol of his occupation for 20 years. He was in a boat, your job, your identity. We all identify with anything we've done for 20 years. We don't know who we are without it. So he says, take it and keep walking inland when you get to the mainland. And when a wayfarer mistakes your oar for a winnowing fan or a winnowing shovel, he says, you have completed your journey, and you are to place the oar in the ground, and now you can go home for good. I mean, these people were geniuses. Even Jesus uses the image of the winnowing fan in Matthew's gospel. It's the image of discrimination, subtlety, discernment, knowing how to distinguish the wheat from the chaff, the essentials from the non-essentials, the real from the unreal. That's maturity. It takes a long time to get there. That's what a teenager doesn't know. They can't know it yet. And in our culture where adolescence is already pushed to 32, you don't even know it in your 30s and your 40s. What's real and what's unreal, what's essential and what's not essential. You have to go through a lot of dyings and a lot of losings to say, I really didn't need that, and I'm still happy. I thought I'd fall apart. I don't need that. I don't need that. I remember my own mother in her later years when I'd come home to visit, and she was always giving things away. Oh, no, I don't need that. Take it, That's where you naturally should be moving. One of the greatest resources for theology, just emerging in the last 15 years, is the entire work of, in fact, I was talking to Dr. Kuhl about it today, who's an obstetrician or a gynecologist, that the two made-to-order spiritual experiences that have been with humanity since the beginning are birth and death. And until really the last 100 years, or 50 years in many cases, birth and death were family experiences, spiritual experiences, and they changed you because you were present at them. And the one I want to especially talk about is death. I've been in contact with a number of hospice workers in recent years, even hospice, which has only emerged in the last 25 years, at least on any broad scale, is trying to turn what has become a medical event into what it always was, a spiritual event, for the transformation of everybody in the family, when you're allowed to accompany a person through the stages of a natural death. They're calling it, and I think the wording is brilliant, enlightenment at gunpoint. It's like, I'm convinced, of course, salvation is not a question of if. Salvation is a question of when. How soon do you get it? How soon can you get what's real and what's unreal? What's essential and what's not essential? What lasts and what doesn't last? What's wonderful and what isn't worth a hill of beans? And we don't get that very quickly in our culture. I am told the American culture of the last 30 years especially, since the proliferation of the media, is the only culture in human history that has idealized teenagers over elders. This is utterly upside down culture, you know. Go to Asia, go to India, go to any of the ancient cultures. What you idealize as being 60 years old, now maybe I want to say that since I'm there now, but we're not going to get anywhere by all wanting to be, teenagers. It really shows a very, very upside down notion. For me, what it shows is we're a first half of life culture. And as a priest, I find that the Christian churches largely do the task of the first half of life over and over and over and over and over again. Just keep reassuring you. I mean, how many times can you get saved on Friday night, I mean, our Catholics just catatonically go to Mass, but sometimes you don't know if they know how to live in communion. They just go to communion, but they're still racists. So, I mean, this doesn't compute. You clearly have not been transformed at any deep level. It's just spinning the prayer wheels of your particular denomination, and you keep doing it over and over again to reassure yourself of what you have clearly not experienced at a deep level. The alcoholics say what characterizes addiction is to keep doing more and more of what isn't working, right? To keep doing over and over again what isn't working. I've been a priest 42 years. I think an awful lot. I can only pick on Catholics. You'll have to apply this if it applies to your group. But I think we just keep doing it over and over and over again, sometimes with little evidence that people are growing up or maturing. I was told just today not to pick on Texas. All of the rest of our states are just as bad. But that in the 60s, I mean, you still had in the Catholic Church, churches for black people and brown people and white people. And they all celebrated the same Eucharist, and they didn't know how to sit at the same table. Well, I mean, come on. We're talking about kindergarten Christianity, not even worthy of that. And people say we didn't need reform. That we could be that immature to think in the mind of God there is a whit of difference between a Mexican and an American and a black person. But we do, and we still do, because we're not based on a transformed mind. Our hearts, basically, we're not in the second half of our own lives. We're still just maintaining our container, and we haven't gotten to the contents. So if the first half of life is the container, the second half of life is what's it all for? The contents. What does it mean that I'm American and Catholic and male and whatever else I want to be that shows I'm the best and shows I'm superior? So the last third of the chapters are called a second simplicity, a bright sadness, shadow boxing, or the shadowlands, new problems and new directions, and finally, falling upward. The title that might strike you as the most strange is A Bright Sadness. I deliberately chose those two words that don't maybe easily go together to try to express what appears to me to be the paradox of a true elder. And we are creating a lot of elderly people, but not a lot of elders. An elder is someone who, it seems to me, does carry a kind of gravitas, sadness, seriousness. They've seen too much. They've been hurt a number of times. They've experienced a number of deaths. You can't just giggle at everything anymore. You know this business of life is serious and short. And by my age, you want to start making sure you're getting the message because you know it's going to be over in a few years. And you long for what the message is, what this life is all about. But simultaneous, and I hope you've met such an elder, simultaneous to that gravitas, that underlying seriousness, there's a brightness, there's a freedom. There's a joy, there's a okayness, there's a contentment, there's an ability to say to the youngers, to the juniors, It's okay. It'll be okay. It will work out. In fact, if you can't say that to the youngers, I don't know what good you are as an elder. I don't know, I don't know what you're doing for your grandchildren. That's your role, right? To be giving the security, the solidity, the okayness. I can hold this together. What you see in an elder is an ability to deal with creative tensions. I look at our politics in America. I mean, it makes you want to cry. I mean, just that these are our well-educated people that we elect and send to Washington, and all they can do is what I call dualistic thinking, either-or thinking. That's precisely not wisdom. Wisdom has always been defined as the ability to see things in terms of both and. That's the difference between knowledge and wisdom. In the first half of life, you get a lot of information that sort of inflates you, while you're right, and your political party has the whole truth, and your country has the whole truth, and your religion has the whole truth. Unless you go through the necessary suffering, you don't see that this is not love of truth, it's love of self. You're not really searching for the truth, you're just trying to ensconce yourself at the top. But if you've never suffered, you'll never know that. You won't. You'll just keep believing the lie that you're the best, you're superior, your race is superior, and your nation is the only one that God has shed his grace on. And right across the border, God just doesn't care about those people. You can really live with those kind of ridiculous illusions. We're creating a high percentage of people that way, who are really incapable of civil dialogue, of humane adult communication. I remember hearing the healthcare debate a few years ago. It's just human beings yelling at one another, just yelling and thinking that if they'd yell louder, this would mean it was true. Or if they'd use more obscene words, this would prove it was true. And unfortunately, when you have a culture at an adolescent level, they buy that. It works. So there's no reason to stop doing it, because in a first half of life culture, that works. You're impressed by loudness and by four-letter words. And that's supposed to mean this guy knows what he's talking about, Rather sad, brothers and sisters. We're not going to get anywhere with that level of consciousness. But fortunately, I really think, if I'm sounding pessimistic, I really think there's an increasing amount of people moving into the second half of life. I find them at every place I go. People who hold together paradoxes, who live with creative tensions, who have a tolerance for ambiguity. Now, the word for that in terms of Christian virtue is patience or love or forgiveness. And we always idealize those things, but we didn't teach people, how do you do that? How do you live with contradictions without what I call non-dual thinking or mystical thinking or contemplative thinking? You don't know how to do that. So I don't think most of our people are bad-willed. I really don't. I think most people are well-intentioned, but we don't have a lot of elders modeling maturity, modeling the second half of life, modeling both and thinking or non-dual thinking. Let me give you, I have a short half chapter toward the beginning of the book on something that I learned through Bill Plotkin. He's going to be teaching with me in January in New Mexico. And he found out that in Japan, after the Second World War, they experienced what we also experienced, but largely did not know what to do with. Now we call it post-traumatic stress disorder. Then we called it shell shock. That a high percentage of their Japanese soldiers were coming back from the Second World War and did not know how to re-enter civil society. They didn't know how to maintain a marriage, how to be a decent father, how to even be a decent neighbor in the community. If you've ever been to Japan, I would say, without any doubt, they're the most ritually sophisticated culture in the world. They have a ritual for everything, It must be very hard to be a Protestant in Japan. Because it's easy for them to be Catholic because we like rituals too. But they know that you can't figure everything out by a sermon. You've got to have a ritual action, a rite of passage to move you from here to there. So they created a rite of passage in Japan for returning soldiers. And it was called discharging the loyal soldier. They would bring the soldier into a central throne almost. The elders and the family and the key members of the community would sit around him, and for however long it took, if it took 3 hours, everybody praised him in every possible way for all of the good he had done for his country, for his loyalty, his patriotism, his hard work, his suffering in the field, for his loyalty to his family and his country. After all praise was exhausted, the elder or the mayor of the village or whoever had the authority stood up and said, "And now, sir, we want to tell you, you are no longer needed as a soldier. We now need you to return as a father, as a citizen, as a brother, and as a friend." They recognize you have to have something that praises what was good and then lets go of it so people can move on to the next stage of life with gratitude and joy and freedom. And we've already found some ways to sort of imitate some of this ritual with people who are totally bound by the conditioning of the first 10 years of their life. And they call it adult Christianity. And they just keep repeating phrases and doctrines. And you say to them, "Do you know what that means? Does that have any content to it? Is there any inner experience that validates your belief in the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit? Or is this just a gesture that you make as a Catholic?" Well, you find out 8 times out of 10, it's just a gesture they make as a Catholic. Does it mean anything beyond maybe a little social security system? Sometimes it doesn't appear to. Because no one told them there is a second half of life. You've got to find the inner meaning of outer things. We must have 30 initiated men in this room, and I think so many men have written me letters after the rites of passage. One of the most common phrases they write to me is something like this. They'll say, "What I found out is things have meaning." Yeah, that everything, the animals and the trees and the sky and the world and time and the Gospels, it all means something. And you realize that up to that point, you've lived on the shell of your life, just going through the motions, just practicing the rituals, spinning the prayer wheels, repeating the Bible phrases, and thinking that by repeating them, that makes them true. Until you go inside, until you go to the bottom of your own experience, largely nothing's true for you. It's just words. And we're an externalized culture. We're content, by and large, to live at that level. So all I'm hoping to do is entice you, invite you, announce to you, and tell you there is something more for all of us, because the second journey really never ends. At the beginning of chapter 12 in the book, New Problems and New Directions, I quote the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama, in one sentence, says for me what it took Paul the entire letter of the Romans to say. You Lutherans love Romans, and I do too, actually. But God, it's tortured logic. Oh, God. Paul is trying so much to get us beyond the law, but just doesn't know how to say it in a simple phrase. Well, the Dalai Lama does. He says, "Learn and obey the rules very well, so you will know how to break them properly." That's what it took all of Romans to say. It's not just you keep repeating the old rules and saying this is the rule. Finally, you got to say, what is it for, and does it apply in this case? I must admit, about a month ago, I live in Albuquerque, as you know, and where there's a mile-long street called 5 Points Road, and the center is on it, and our guest house is on it, and the Catholic worker house is on it, sort of a Catholic row. And on the end is the Franciscan house and the big Franciscan church, and I live in a little hermitage around the corner. And I make the trip 2 or 3 times a day in my truck around the corner. And, you know, I've learned not to stop at the stop sign. That's right. I mean, no one's ever there. There's not much traffic, so I've just gotten used to not making a full stop. So sure enough, I make the stop and I see some lights behind me. I pull in real close to the church to let him know I'm the priest. You know, I thought that would get me out of the ticket. And he says, "Don't get out of the car. I'm coming." And I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "Did you realize there's a stop sign there?" And I said, "Yes, officer, I did." And he said, "Did you stop at it?" And I said, "Well, not totally." And I said, "Can I tell you something?" And I said, and I was trying to play the priest card, I admit it. But I said, "You know, I hear confessions in this church. And when people come and confess their sins to me, I don't just impose the penance or I say, well, did the rule apply? Did the rule apply in your case, you know? So give me the context for when you committed this sin, and let's talk about it a little bit." It wasn't working at all. He said, "Let me see your driver's license." And he said, "You really are the priest, aren't you?" He said, "Okay, Father, I'm going to give you a warning. You must stop at that stop sign." Now, I got to admit to you, now I look in the rear view mirror, but when there's nobody around, I don't stop. I don't. Now, maybe that means I'm a compulsive personality, but what I'd like to think it means is a rule has meaning when a rule has meaning, all right? And when there's nobody around coming either way, why should I stop? Do you understand? Now, I know if he catches me again, he won't be impressed by that answer, all right? But that's what Paul meant in Galatians by the freedom of the children of God. The law is not an end in itself. For freedom, God has made you free. And if there's one thing Christians are afraid of, it's gospel freedom. Why? Because most of Christianity up to now has been first half of life. The rules are ends in themselves. And what happens is basically the great points of the gospel: mercy, justice, good faith, forgiveness, and compassion are unlivable. They're impractical. They don't work. You never even get that far to ask the real questions of the gospel, which always demand a certain degree of ambiguity. Our word for that was faith. It's putting together knowing with not knowing. You're never 100% certain you're right when you're walking in faith. That's why it's called faith. You'd think we'd get that, you know? But we haven't trained people how to hold ambiguity, how to live with knowing and not knowing at the same time, how to know that God's love is so foundational, so certain, so absolute, so constant, and so eternal that I can even risk making a mistake and it's not the end of the world. That's what a second half of life person knows. So let me end this, before I open it up to questions, by how I ended the book. There's a man, might be a name that a lot of you are not familiar with, Thomas Merton. He'll probably go down as the most significant American Catholic of the 20th century. He died in 1968, tragically. And shortly before that, he wrote a poem called "Winning the Soul of the Serene Disciple." I read it when I was making a retreat there in Kentucky, and never forgot it. I'm first going to read it, and then give you just a slight, not the whole chapter of commentary, but a slight commentary. Because for me, he sums up in this poem the freedom and the grace and the compassion of a second half of life person. When in the soul of a serene disciple, with no more fathers to imitate, see, first half of life is all imitating what other people say. Poverty is now a success. And he's not talking about material poverty. He's talking about inner freedom, where I don't have to be certain that I'm right or I'm best. It's a small thing now to say that the roof is gone. I don't even have a house. Stars as well as friends are angry with my noble ruin. You tend to lose some friends when you become a second half of life person, I warn you. You can't join in the usual jokes at the cocktail party anymore. The way everybody in Texas talks will not be your way of talking. I'm sorry to tell you that. The totally Republican agenda, the total Democrat agenda, which your cocktail party group wants you to buy into, you can't anymore. You can't. You know better. You know that it's not true. You know that it's a lie, in fact. So you often just have to put your head down or keep quiet. Or what I often just say is, well, I have to think about that a little more. No point in correcting people. That never does any good. Stars as well as friends are angry with your noble ruin. Saints are departing in all directions. I quote in this last book, Teresa of Avila's wonderful line. She says, "Oh God, deliver me from most saints." These sanctimonious people who are born again. It's like, oh my God. If this is the goal, I don't want to go there, you know. And that's not always true, but too often it is true. Be still. There is no longer any need of comment. That's all the mind does, is make endless commentary on everything, all the time. And that's what contemplation teaches you not to do. Don't do it. Don't believe it. Don't believe your own PR, because it's all about you. And it's all about your own anger and your own fear and your own agenda, and it won't get you very far. So you need a new way of thinking. Be still. There is no longer any need of comment. It was a lucky wind that blew away your halo with all your cares. It was a lucky sea that drowned your reputation. Brothers and sisters, if you have a good reputation, be careful. You got to live up to it. You got to pretend it's true. And you got to keep pretending at ever higher levels. One reason I became a Franciscan is because, if you know anything about the life of St. Francis, he tried to be the lowest man in town. So he'd had nothing to prove and nothing to protect and nothing to live up to. Here at this place, Merton says, you will find neither a proverb nor a memorandum. Now there are no ways, no perfectly right ways that are always true for everybody all the time. There are no methods to admire. I don't know if we should tell the Methodists that there are no methods to admire. Poverty now is no achievement. It's just what you fall into when you're honest and humble. Here, God lives in my emptiness like an affliction. What choice remains? Well, now, he wrote this about 67. He dies in 68. What choice remains? Well, to be ordinary is not a choice. It's the usual freedom of men without their visions. Their visions, their idealized notions of what they have to be superior or to be loved by God. So you can see a man at the end of his life pretty much free from everything, not needing to please, but not wanting to displease either. living in that freedom of knowing and not knowing at the same time. That's second half of life freedom. But let me end with one thing, because I know this deserves so many good questions to make me fill in the gaps that I didn't fill. There's a principle that I'm finding more and more important as I get older, and it's called transcend and include. As you transcend to higher levels of freedom and gospel and grace and maturity and love, you always include the previous stages. It's not either or thinking. You don't throw out the law. You don't throw out traditions. You're not on bended knee before them. You know, I'll tell you something. This is going to really upset the Catholics. But I'm a priest, and you know, we Catholics are supposed to go to Mass on Sunday. I was staying in a Franciscan house at Mission San Jose, and I had a beautiful, quiet morning this morning to do some reading and journaling and private praying, and I didn't go to Mass this morning. Now, my God, some of you are going to report me to the bishop, I'm sure. But I still love the Mass. I would still celebrate the Eucharist, but I'm ashamed to tell you, well, really, I'm not ashamed at all. I don't feel an ounce of guilt about that. Do you understand? The important thing is to be in communion all the time, 24 hours a day, not just the ritualization of communion. So I don't throw out the earlier traditions. I love them. I respect them. I honor them. I know, in fact, it was years of loyalty to that got me to this. By honoring the container, you get to the contents and to what the contents really mean. So I want to repeat that as strongly as I can. The second half of life does not throw out the first half of life, but it does see it through a very, very different lens. That's what it means. I would like to think, I hope, is an elder, is someone who can tell you what it's really about. Thinking of Thomas Merton, I haven't told this story in years. In one of his later books, he talks about meeting Daisaitsu Daisuke, the greatest Zen practitioner at that time in the 1960s. And they came together for a Christian-Buddhist dialogue. And Suzuki came to observe a Christian Eucharist, knowing that was the great ritual of Christians. And then he invited Thomas Merton to attend the Japanese tea ceremony. Now, if you've ever attended it, everything is done with meticulous, perfect ritualization, with delicacy, with slowness, with grace, with loveliness. It's like their communion, and then you both drink of the tea at the end. But he said he was sitting there wanting to be a good Buddhist. Merton is saying this. He's trying to be very reverent, and he's noticing Suzuki pouring the tea very gently into the beautiful china cup. And then he notices that Suzuki just keeps pouring it. And in fact, it overcomes the cup, and it covers the whole table, and it's dripping on their habits, and it's covering the floor. And then Suzuki just drops the pitcher and claps and laughs hilariously and says, "You and I know, this is all just ritual. It's all just a game. It's all just a game till you get to the place of stillness and freedom and joy and contentment and peace. And then you've gone beyond the tea ceremony to know what the tea ceremony is really all about. But most people just keep celebrating the tea ceremony. Most people just keep raising the flag and saluting and saying, what does that mean? And what does that not mean? What does it not need to mean? Until you get to those critical questions of the middle of life and the pain that they bring. I warn you, if you don't have guides, if you don't have wisdom people, if you don't have elders, most people don't know how to traverse the 40s and the 50s, which is when you should be doing this if you're on schedule. And so they just remain spiritually 35 forever. Because there's no one there to tell them what's real and what's unreal, what life is all about and what life is not all about. So, I know, brothers and sisters, this is a dangerous book to have written. I know that it's open to all kind of misinterpretation. I'm not trying to make heretics or iconoclasts or rebels or sinners out of any of you. I've got better things to do with my life. But I hope it does provide you with an opportunity and an ability to recognize the grace that your life offers you. Your path is not my path. Your journey is not to do it the way I did it, and mine is not to do it the way you did it. But your job is to remain faithful to that deepest core that we called our soul. And at that level, there's a knowing that holds you fast. There's a knowing that keeps you true to the deeper truth and leads you to where, first of all, you would rather not go, but in the end, where you know you had to go. And I'm sure you recognize what I'm quoting there, probably the most significant biblical text for what I'm trying to say. If you think this has no biblical foundation, although it's all the way through as far as I can see. But that marvelous story at the end of John's Gospel, where he says, Peter, when you were young, you dressed yourself, you put your own clothes on, and you went where you wanted to go. Peter, when you're an old man, and he has the image of a little 4-year-old kid putting out his arms so his mother can dress him. You'll put out your hands, someone else will dress you and lead you where you would rather not go. That's the intermediate journey. It takes faith. It takes an ability to endure a certain degree of darkness, a certain degree of not knowing, which I call faith. And then you know that you have done what you had to do. But you did it almost, not just almost, really. You did it in spite of yourself. You know you were being led when you get there. I know I didn't plan this life for myself. I know I never expected to be in this position at this age. I never expected to write 30 books. I never expected to write one. And all you can really do is get out of the way and allow it to happen. We really are, brothers and sisters, very often, maybe always, our own worst enemy. And I hope this gives you a bit of freedom to trust something more than your own worst enemy, to trust that you are being guided, you are being led. There is one who believes in you more than you believe in yourself, who knows you more than you know yourself, and who surely loves you more than you love yourself. Thank you. Now we're going to take a little while. I don't know, do we have a microphone? Yes, you do. Very good. 2 of them. Thank you. All right. So anybody who has any questions, we won't go much beyond 20 minutes or so. But here we go. There's a question right there.
Richard, is that working? I'm
Yes.
relieved you didn't offer us, you said you weren't going to offer any answers because I don't know how to frame this question. But at 67, your book makes perfect sense to me. But what about, I see more and more people who've they don't have a ladder to climb, or they never went up one. They found the first floor exit.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm just begging for your next book, but where are we in that?
Excellent. Now, this is certainly a phenomenon of our deconstructed culture, that more and more people are not even able to do the first half of life well. And that's what I was referring to with the guys at the jail, that they didn't even have the training, the eldering, the impulse control, the discipline, the obedience to law to know how to build a container. Now, if I'm to believe the gospel and my own experience, that can be either an advantage, although that's in a smaller percentage of cases, In most, it's a disadvantage, that they have to grow up backwards. Now that explains, I hope, the phenomenon of fundamentalism all over the world. Right? That when you didn't get certitudes, order, clarity, like any good Montessori teacher will tell you, children need predictability. They can't have parents who are totally chaotic and changing their minds all the time. If you have that predictability as a kid, ironically, you internalize it and you don't need it. If you didn't have it as a kid, you need scripture quotes that are absolutely true all the time for everybody and always have. You have this undue mania for order and certitude at 35, when you should be moving beyond it, or just starting to move beyond it, you see. So that's why fundamentalism is growing in Islam. Now there we can see it, and all hate it and fear it, you know. But to recognize that most of Christianity is going the same direction, by people who, instead of a journey of faith, are searching for a journey of certitude every step of the way. But this gives me a sympathetic understanding of them. They normally grew up in abusive, chaotic, disordered families and lives where there was no order. So the mania for certitude and order, by the time you're 25, 30, 35, is so deep. You have to have it. That's why I talked about my Kansas beginnings. I had it. Everything was certain when I was growing up. So much so that when the 60s came, I didn't need it anymore. But it wasn't because I threw it out. I'd internalized discipline, impulse control, respect for law, respect for traditions. Now, I've got it inside. I don't need to overdo it, you see. But fundamentalism overdoes what was not done, if that makes sense. It's scary. I don't know. God is certainly going to get us through this because God gets us through everything. But God's got God's work cut out. Because we have such a high percentage of people who don't want faith and trust. They want answers and certitude. The exact opposite of biblical faith.
I have a question about technology in terms of what you're talking about with the first half and second half of life. How do you see technology playing a role in that? Do you see it having a negative impact or positive or any impact at all?
Boy, that's a good one. I don't want to be a Luddite, all right? I clearly, I have a computer like most of us do. I drive cars like most of us do. I just got a cell phone, and it's sure helpful at airports, especially. But here's my concern about it, and that's all I can say, because it's not going to go away, so we better learn how to deal with it, how to compensate for it. And that would be my concern in teaching people silence and contemplation, to compensate for it, because it's not going to go away. By giving you quick, predictable responses through media by click, click. This is almost the opposite of contemplation. So it is dangerous. That we just have too instantaneous experience and too much vicarious experience. And there are now support groups proliferating all over this country for young males in particular, whose sexuality is so visual that their entire sexual experience is pornographic already by 13, and that they don't actually know how to relate to a real woman. That's probably just a gross but very real example of how vicarious experience can destroy and even make unnecessary real experience. That you can relate to people by images on screens and achieve your sexual satisfaction in that way, instead of, if you're a married man, you're sure the trials of communication, of forgiveness, of letting go of your own will and letting go of your own agenda that real love and real marriage demands. So I give that as a pretty strong example, maybe too strong, but of the severe dangers of letting technology form the consciousness. If it forms these neural grooves too deeply, you know what you're doing in contemplation is refusing to return to your usual practiced responses. When your fear comes up, you let go of it. When your anger comes up, you let go of it. When your lust comes up, you let go of it. And so it's a practice in inner freedom where I don't go in the direction of my obsessive thoughts. As I say in the new book on Breathing Underwater, Bill Wilson was talking about alcohol. But what the great religions recognized was that there is one universal addiction. And the universal addiction, true of every one of us in this room, without knowing you personally, is we are all addicted to our way of thinking. Now, technology has a very strong ability to form that software. And if you don't watch it, if you don't compensate for it by practices of inefficiency, contemplation, not getting your own way immediately, I would say we're going to have a very strange consciousness 10 years from now by our kids who are totally growing up by click, click. Because you who have lived to the second half of life chronologically, you know that marriage problems aren't dealt with by click, click, or any problems. So it's got severe dangers. But again, don't hear me as saying throw it out. I'm not in that direction. I just say work to undo it practically and concretely.
Father, this is kind of about containment. Many of us, if maybe not, maybe all of us, have grown up in religious communities where that was part of things, but now have come to a point where maybe we found that our religious communities have stung us or stung other people. Yet, we need the sense of the body of Christ. We need the sense of the rituals. We need a sense, perhaps, of sacraments. What do you say a choice would be, other than holding one's nose, to be part of a church?
Yeah. Well, you know, I look at the history of, I was able to address the Carmelite chapter of the Worldwide Order of Carmelites early in this month. And I recognized in their tradition, they were very similar to my own Franciscan tradition. That again and again, after living in community for 20, 30, 40, even 50 years, it was very common in the last years, in the later years of a monk or friar's life, that they would become hermits. They would leave the social thing to be able to ask different questions. We are calling this, in terms of Christianity, and the question you're asking, emerging Christianity. The people are not totally leaving their denominations. There's too much good there. There's too much that's right there. But they're finding parallel institutions which can answer different questions, and so they don't put all of their eggs in their Catholic basket or Lutheran basket, but not in a rebellious way. Can you hear the difference? I'm not talking about rebellion. I'm talking totally positively, lovingly, caringly. I know men, for example, who 2 Sundays out of the month rebuild houses for Habitat for Humanity on Sundays instead of going to church. Well, you know, I mean, do we mean those sermons we give about you're supposed to serve your neighbor? And they say, I just don't need to hear another sermon about it. This Sunday, I'm going to do it. How can you knock that, you know? Or I was talking about hospice ministry. I know 2 women who are, my God, they become living saints by accompanying other people in the last months and weeks of their life in hospice. This is their Sunday church. Some of us term this emerging Christianity. But it emerges along with non-dual thinking, where it's not done like the earlier Reformations were, where you totally threw out the previous denomination and said the previous denomination was 100% wrong. We don't have time for that kind of dualistic thinking anymore. So we say, stay with the church, the community that mothered you, that fathered you. Don't waste time reacting against it. Say it was good for this and this and this and this. It wasn't so good on this and this and this and that. It's okay, you know. But you find a way to compensate for what it wasn't so good on. This very phenomenon of emerging Christianity, to me, shows an immense maturing of human consciousness. We never thought of reforming things that way before, because we thought the only way to do it was a violent, angry, oppositional way. And we're talking about forming church in a prayerful way. I remember I was actually giving a retreat to some Anglican bishops. Oh, this was 10 years ago. This very proper Anglican bishop, knowing he was speaking to me as a Catholic, he said, "Father, you do know that we now realize that it was no way to start a church by killing Catholics for 60 years. This is not a spiritual reform, all right? But we just didn't have that consciousness in the 16th century, you know? We could start a spiritual reform by killing people who were, he went on to say, he says, Henry VIII was not St. Francis of Assisi, all right? And we know it was all historical accident, but we now have the freedom to see those things, that we've all been, Roman Catholics included, the victims of historical accidents, historical reactions that brought about good things and not so good things. That's okay. A mature adult can hold that. That's what I mean by living with paradox.
Richard, you were talking about, you mentioned people in their 40s and 50s, if they're on track going from the first half to the second half, and somewhere in the middle there, I'm hoping I'm repeating you correctly, as they traverse that journey, I assume that another name for that is the road to transformation. Okay. But so, I mean, I've gone through the Men's Rites of Passage in 2001, and after everything that's occurred to me since then, including a regular contemplative prayer practice, I have to honestly say that I am not quite sure whether I am a transformed man or not.
That's a good answer. That's an honest answer. Thank you. Thank you. I'm not either. We're all just on the path. That's all. Yeah.
I take a look at some of my brothers, all right, who seem, my perception of them, seem like they are more transformed. Okay, and maybe that's a mistake getting into this comparison game. Maybe that's not a good sign of moving in the direction of the second half of life. But sometimes that's kind of a pervasive question in my mind.
Okay, you are right. You answered your own question there at the end. When you're really on the other side, you know it's all mystery and it's all grace, and you do stop comparing and competing. It's only the ego that wants to compare and compete. When you live at the soul level instead of the ego level, you know all your comparisons are merely egocentric judgments anyway, narcissistic reactions from your reference point. And so you stop taking them seriously. And you were already doing that at the end. But you're still tempted, because you're a man in the middle of life, to say, oh God, he's a little more mature than I am. It really doesn't matter. You are who you are. All you can do is be faithful to the path. But that you have the honesty and humility to say, I don't know that I am transformed. You know, you were initiated enough years ago to know that all the rites of passage do is open the doorway and show you the direction. But The real initiation takes place afterwards. Since you brought that up, Terry Frisbee encouraged me to mention the dates. November 9th to 13th will be the next Texas Rites of Passage at Ebert Ranch. It's a Lutheran camp near Harper, Texas. November 9th to 13th. If anybody's interested, just go. We have a website called Men as Learners and Elders, males it spells, and you can find if you're interested. We'd love to have some of you join us at that time, especially if it's going to produce men like you who can be so honest. You know, everybody respects an honest, humble person. We don't need great people. We need honest, humble people. They keep growing. They never stop growing. Thank you.
In your attack on certainty or support of ambiguity, however you want to phrase it, how do you respond to scripture that seems to, or at least seems to at face value, have an air of certainty about it? The one I'm in particular thinking of is when Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life, the only way to the Father." Why did I know you were
going to use that? Okay, it comes up every time. Why do we get so much mileage out of that one line from John's Gospel? Unbelievable. Okay, but it's fair enough. It's fair enough. All right. First of all, we'll have to end on this. First of all, when Jesus says he's the way, the truth, and the life, the first conclusion we should come to is that we're not. Do you understand? If he is, then we're not. Huh? But for some reason, we assume he's talking about an institution or a religion or a group, because that's the way third level consciousness, tribal thinking works. You know, it's all about belonging to a group, you see. And that's a big leap for him to say, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. Now, secondly, I don't know how much scripture study you've been able to do, but we know that John's gospel was written somewhere between 90 and 100. Jesus has been gone for 70 years. This quote is found in no other gospel. What we have in John's gospel is a marvelous, marvelous mystical theology where we have the eternal Christ speaking. This is not Jesus of Nazareth. This is the Christ. Huh? And the Christ is announcing what is eternally true. I am the way. I am the bread. I am the path. I am the gate of the sheepfold. And this is true of the Christ mystery. Now, I'm going to have to probably go farther than you wanted me to go, but let me put it in this way. I have to say it in a shocking way because most Christians haven't thought about this yet, it seems. Christ is not Jesus' last name, all right? Jesus became the Christ. If you doubt that, and if you doubt that that's scriptural, read the first chapter of Colossians, the first chapter of Ephesians, the prologue to John's Gospel, and the first chapter of the first letter of John. They all say without any equivocation that Christ existed from all eternity, right? The Franciscan tradition, we always emphasized the eternal Christ, and that Jesus came in a moment of time to reveal what was eternally true. That's scriptural, but it just was never emphasized in most churches. It's all there once you see it, and you wonder why you never saw it. So the Christ was born, as Colossians clearly says, 1:15 to 20. The Christ was born at in the moment we would now call the Big Bang, right? When God decided to materialize, when God decided to show God's self and become visual or visible. So that means the incarnation began 14.5 billion years ago, all right? The human incarnation that we Christians love in Jesus began 2,000 years ago, when consciousness was perhaps ready to fall in love with a person, because we can't fall in love with concepts or universal truths or universal mysteries. So this eternal Christ is revealed, we Christians would believe, in Jesus. And what you have in John's Gospel, or that quote from the 14th chapter, you have the eternal Christ announcing that the Christ mystery, when matter and spirit are one, when spirit reveals itself through the material world, that is the way for everybody. That's the way for a Hindu. That's the way for a Buddhist. We've all got to put matter and spirit together. We've all got to put the divine and the human together. Jesus, for us, does it, right? Jesus personifies the human and the divine put together in one place. I'm going to say one more shocking thing. Please don't report me to the bishop. Well, no, you can report me because it's true, and he'll know it's true. Strictly speaking, it is in, now don't walk out till I finish. Strictly speaking, it is not correct to say Jesus is God. Right? It's not. Jesus is the combination of God and human. That's different than saying Jesus is God. And that shows how immature most Christianity has been. We just walk around, Jesus is God, Jesus is God. That misses the whole Trinitarian mystery that John's gospel in fact reveals. Jesus, in fact, is the putting together in one place of one who is fully human and fully divine at the same time. That is a completely different statement.